Well, ladies and gentlemen, here we go. Paramount question you will have to answer as jurors in this case has to do with sanity, specifically the defendant's sanity. At the conclusion of the evidence, the court will give you jury instructions. One specific jury instruction will talk specifically about insanity. It will read that as to the question of sanity, the defendant was insane at the time of the commission of the acts if she was so diseased or defective in mind at the time of the commission of the acts as to be incapable of distinguishing right from wrong with respect to that act, or she suffered from a condition of mind caused by a mental disease or defect that prevented her from forming a culpable mental state. That is an essential element of a crime charge. A culpable mental state is like an intentionally or knowingly. Evidence in this case will show that she could distinguish between right and wrong, and that she was absolutely capable of forming the specific intent required for these charges. Those instructions will go on to give specific guidance on what qualifies as a mental disease or defect. It says care should not be taken to confuse mental disease or defect with moral obliquity, mental depravity, passion growing out of anger, revenge, or hatred, or other motives and kindred evil conditions. Because when an act is induced by any of these causes, the ones that I just listed, the person is accountable to the law, meaning that person can be found guilty for committing crimes charged. You should consider the evidence you will hear in this case in context with that instruction. This case is about two people. First is Gannon Stauch, an 11-year-old little boy, came into this world premature, weighing just 1 pound 6 ounces. He proved to be a fighter, overcame the difficulties associated with being born so small. He's survived by his mother, Landon Hyatt, his father, Al Stauch, and his precocious little sister, Layla. On January 26, 2020, something bad happened inside the Stauch family home. Gannon suffered some burns. You'll learn this from a video recording this defendant made that night, January 26th. You'll hear her as she manipulated Gannon, putting guilt on him for some mistake that a child made. And in that recording, you'll hear Gannon say in his own words, "I'm just worried about my burns."
I just don't know what to do.
Well, devastating. Initially, Scott, I can't lie when the TMZ information.
Gannon, I promise this is the last time I'm gonna ask you. I'm just freaked out, okay? Are you sure you didn't do it on purpose? Okay, you promise. You promise. Pinky promise. Okay, all right, so listen. We're, all right, we're gonna have to sell stuff to fix it, okay? So we figure out what we gotta sell. We can sell the sofa. We can sell whatever, because we gotta get it fixed. So lady, don't be mad at us and kick us out of the house. Okay? You got it? You got it?
I'm just worried about my
Okay, shh, listen. So tomorrow,
The other person in this case is that last voice you just heard, who said so tomorrow. This lady sitting right here, the defendant. January 26, 2020 and into January 27, 2020, she was the sole provider for Gannon. Her husband, Al Stauch, Gannon's father, serves in the National Guard. He was in Oklahoma for National Guard training, left that Saturday night, the 25th. Everything that happened to Gannon from that point forward was her decision. She carried out actions to kill Gannon, to put his body in a suitcase and hide it, to hide evidence of what she did to Gannon. Told numerous stories to investigators to manipulate the course of the investigation. And finally, to discard Gannon inside that suitcase off of a Florida bridge like garbage. January 27, 2020, Gannon's home, located at 6627 Mandan Drive, here in Colorado Springs, Colorado, turned into the stuff of nightmares. In fact, the one place a little boy like Gannon should have felt the safest, his bedroom, turned into, like I said, the stuff of nightmares. That bedroom is in fact where he was brutally murdered. The defendant attacked him viciously, mercilessly, deliberately, and intentionally. These are exhibits that you'll see from the doctor down in Florida, Dr. Ignacio, when she performed the autopsy. He'll tell you that Gannon suffered 18 stab wounds to his body, his chest, his back, his head, and most importantly, his arms and his hands. Why is that important? Gannon was fighting for his life, and those were defensive wounds. Next came a crushing blow to his head that was so strong, it fractured his skull like an eggshell. But that wasn't enough for this defendant. He retrieved a 9mm handgun, fired it at Gannon 3 times. 2 bullets struck the pillow near him and were caught in the fibers of that pillow. That 3rd bullet entered his jaw, traveled through his head, fracturing his mandible, his vertebrae, hitting his spinal cord, and lodged in the back of his head and was recovered at autopsy. Gannon's life drained from his body, drop by drop. The photo that's on the screen right now is a picture of his bedroom. Same corner where he was in that picture, or where you'll see him in the picture in the bed. Each one of those markers signifies a small blood drop that's splattered across his wall. It ran down the corner of his mattress, up through the carpet padding, and puddled on the concrete foundation below that carpet. The defendant then took very deliberate action. She decided to hide her crimes from the world, and she took action to hide those crimes from the world. She collected Gannon's bloody and broken body and the blankets and pillow that were near him and shoved them into a suitcase and hid them in the storage unit in that basement. That basement storage unit is right around the corner from Gannon's bedroom. What she didn't know is that she was leaving clues behind in that storage room. That plastic tub that you see in the bottom left portion of that picture has Gannon's blood on it. There was an Amazon box in that storage room that has Gannon's blood on it. The concrete floor in that storage room had Gannon's blood on it. The defendant next decided to clean Gannon's room. Deliberately, intentionally, knowing what she was doing. She scrubbed the walls, cleaning them off. She scrubbed the carpet with scrub brushes that were later found in the dishwasher. Those scrub brushes have carpet fibers in them. They have blood on them. They have Gannon's DNA on them. This is Gannon's bedroom when members of the El Paso County Sheriff's Office first came to the house on January 27th in the evening hours. This is what it looked like. No obvious signs of a struggle. No obvious signs of blood as they walked through the house and through Gannon's bedroom. There were no obvious signs of a struggle or a murder because the defendant had cleaned them up. And also realized she had Gannon's blood on her person. Clothes that she was wearing, likely containing Gannon's blood, based off of how much blood had hit the walls, were never found. Her clothing was never found. These shoes, the defendant's shoes, were found on the washing machine, drying. That reddish rust color that you can see on the soles, Gannon's blood and DNA were found on those shoes. You can see just how much blood she was walking through as she was cleaning up that mess. Took more deliberate action. She collected and discarded other important clues. I mentioned she stabbed Gannon 18 times. The instrument that she used to stab Gannon has never been found. That 9mm handgun that she used to fire 3 rounds at Gannon, shell casing ejected out of that firearm each time she pulled the trigger. No shell casing was ever found in Gannon's room. She then took more deliberate action when she hid Gannon in a suitcase, first in her car, and then up north near the El Paso County, Douglas County line. GPS location data was used to track her locations or her movements. And it led to another grisly discovery up just in this area here. A board was found under a tree. That board had Gannon's blood on it. This is miles away from the Stauch family home, which is in the southeast part of the city, close to the airport. You'll learn through testimony that this board came from the Stauch family garage. Then took more deliberate and thoughtful action. She loaded the suitcase containing Gannon into the back of a rented van and drove to Florida. And that's the course of her travels from here to Florida. She rented a hotel room in Pensacola, Florida on February 4th, 2020. She drove a short distance from that hotel room, which is sort of by those blue angular marks on the map, up to where that red square is on the map. Drove a short distance from that hotel room, across a dark bridge that drives over a river that flows into the Gulf of Mexico. There she acted with determined purpose. Stopped that van. She hauled the suitcase out of the back of that van, drug it to the side of the road, hoisted it up over the railing, pushed it over the side, hoping that Gannon would never be found. 48 days later, 1,300 miles away from where Gannon was murdered, the search for answers and Gannon's remains finally ended on March 17, 2020, when the suitcase that came from that basement storage room, Gannon's remains, blankets, and the pillow were found by an unlucky bridge worker checking that bridge for safety. Imagine the shock that he felt when he realized what was inside that suitcase. Inside that suitcase, obviously Gannon's decomposing remains. Also, these two blankets and that pillow. Remember the pictures that I showed just a moment ago of Gannon in bed? These pictures were taken by this defendant on the morning of January 27, 2020. Sent them by text message to Gannon's father, Al, who was in Oklahoma for training. Take note of those blankets. Take note of the blankets that were recovered from that suitcase. The very same blankets and pillow that were in those pictures on January 27, 2020 were found 1,300 miles away with Gannon underneath that bridge. The defendant then purposely, intentionally came up with numerous different stories about what had happened. Gannon was missing, went to a friend's house and never returned. Gannon was kidnapped and she was raped by a guy named Eduardo. Gannon was kidnapped and she was raped, but this time by a guy named Quincy Brown. She went to look for a bike up near that Douglas County, El Paso County line. Gannon test rode that bike, crashed, and suffered a horrible head injury. And a guy named Quincy Brown takes Gannon, and now the defendant doesn't know where Gannon is. Cartels were somehow involved with Gannon's disappearance. And most cruelly, that Landon Hyatt, Gannon's mother, was involved with Gannon's disappearance. All of her actions were purposely designed by her to distance herself from what she did. Throw off investigators, buy her time, escape accountability for what she did to Gannon on January 27, 2020. At the conclusion of the evidence that we'll be presenting in this case, you'll be asked to determine whether the defendant is guilty or not guilty of the charges that we've leveled against her. You'll also be asked to determine whether she was sane or insane at the time that she killed Gannon. All of her decisions, all of her deliberate actions betray her claims of insanity. She knew that what she had done to Gannon was wrong. Why hide it? You'll hear her own voice through recorded phone calls and interviews. The evidence itself will prove her sanity. As jurors, part of your job will be to determine how much credibility, if any, you give to the witnesses. That same rule applies to expert witnesses. You'll get to hear from doctors. You'll get to hear from GPS expert witnesses. Lawyers get tongue-tied sometimes. And when they take the stand and take an oath, you get to judge whether what they are saying makes sense. Is it credible or not? And if it's not credible, you get to discard it. If it's credible, you can use it in your deliberations, but you all get to decide whether that credibility extends to that witness or not. The same will hold true for our expert witnesses and the defense expert witnesses. Get to hear from a doctor that will testify that the defendant was insane at the time of the murder of Gannon Stauch on January 27, 2020. With all expert witnesses, you should gauge what they're saying, measure it against the other evidence that you're hearing. Does it make sense or not? Like all expert witnesses, if it doesn't make sense, you can discard it. You'll also hear from others who knew her best. People that have the best opportunity to see how she was acting. Did she understand the difference between right and wrong? Could she form intent? People like Al Stauch, the man who was married to her. People like her brother, Dakota Lowry, who flew out here after Gannon went missing. And most importantly, her very own daughter, Harley Hunt. See, Harley Hunt was at the best position to know the defendant's state of mind, especially as it relates to when this crime occurred. He was the only other older person in the house. When Al left to Oklahoma, Harley Hunt was working. She's young, 17 years old at the time, thinking about going into the Air Force. But she becomes the defendant's closest confidant after the defendant killed Gannon Stauch. In fact, she also rode with the defendant on that van ride from Colorado Springs to Florida. She'll be able to tell you in her own words, whether the defendant understood the difference between right and wrong, whether she could act intentionally or deliberately or not. And she'll tell you that she could on both counts. Remember, this case is about two people. Gannon had no choice what happened to him that day on January 27th. The other, this defendant, she held every single decision in her hands. She took deliberate, thoughtful action that ended a precious life and tore a family apart. The things we have to prove are the elements of the crimes charged. We also have to disprove that the defendant is insane, meaning essentially we have to prove that she was sane. The evidence will do that for you. We will ask you to give justice to Gannon Stauch. We will ask you to find this defendant guilty for what she did to him more than 3 years ago. We'll ask you to find her guilty of murder in the first degree. Murder in the first degree of a child under 12 years of age. Tampering with a deceased human body for taking Gannon's body from that scene and transporting it across the country. And tampering with physical evidence. We'll ask you to convict her on each and every one of those charges. And the evidence will guide you towards those convictions. On January 27, 2020, 6:55 p.m., the defendant herself called 911. She called 911 to report that Gannon was missing and not come home. Call taker, you'll hear, ask the defendant, who was the last person to see Gannon?
Who was the last person to see him? I guess me?
The evidence will show that she was the last person to see Gannon alive. The evidence will show that she was sane on January 27, 2020, when she ended Gannon's life. The evidence will show that she acted intentionally and deliberately when she took Gannon's life. And then we will ask you to convict her. Thank you.
What do you think about insanity? Is it valid? Something that's legitimate. A lot of people said insanity is just a way to get out of taking responsibility. It's an excuse. Doesn't exist. It's fake. Got a lot of that. So I, as the defense attorney, have two big problems in the case. I represent Ms. Stauch, who according to a lot of jury questionnaires is evil and guilty. And us raising insanity is a bunch of BS. A lot to deal with. Been looking at this case for going on 3 years now. All the photos, I've seen all the reports Mr. Tellini has. It's a lot. What you saw on the board this afternoon, that's the PG stuff, the rated G information, photos you're going to see. For a general audience, go forward in this case, you're going to see the autopsy photos. You're going to see the photos of when Gannon was brought out of the suitcase. And they're horrible. Horrible. It was an awful, awful thing that was done to Gannon. And I see Mr. Allen get up here and he's emotional, almost into tears talking about it. And I get it. I get it. What happened to that little 11-year-old boy is beyond description. The facts of this case. Awful. You know, it's so bad. This is a lost cause. Ladies and gentlemen, I can't quit. I can't leave this courtroom. Got to do my job in this case. Mr. Tellini does. I can't just, after that opening statement, all the information that I've seen, the photos, the smiling picture of Gannon, hearing about him being shot and stabbed multiple times. Hundreds of witnesses and 800 pieces of evidence that are going to come in. I can't check out now and just sit down and write this out. I can't do it because it wouldn't be fair. Wouldn't be fair to the court system, the process, and it wouldn't be fair to Ms. Stauch. And I know people will say, well, who gives a shit about what's fair for Ms. Stauch? The court systems do. The law does. The Constitution, the Bill of Rights was killed back in January 20. How do you figure that out? How do you look into the mind of a sick person and divine what they are thinking? Well, evidence, people's statements, observations, recorded statements, phone call, heard Ms. Stauch talking on. That's good stuff. What else can you look at? Motive? What's somebody's motive? Remember that word? Up every day during jury selection for the past 2 weeks by the prosecution. Motive. You were told, and rightly so, by the prosecution that there is no requirement for the prosecution to prove motive. They're right. Does that mean that motive doesn't matter? No, it doesn't. Not mean that. Even the own jury instruction talking about insanity, the prosecution just put up on the board, talked about motive or lack of motive could be a sign that there is insanity or not insanity. And it's in the jury instruction there. So it does matter. It's not required, but it matters. And it matters because it's evidence. You don't have a motive, that goes to show a lack of evidence, Gage. Because in the case of Ms. Stauch, her abuser was also the person that provided her means for survival. A 4, 5, 6-year-old kid does not go out and get a job and work and acquire their own food, pay the electric bill, pay the rent. So while they're being abused, they also, as a matter of survival, have to both hate and love, to fear and placate their abuser / caretaker. How does a person do that? Well, I think in a lot of situations, no one person can do that. That's where the fragmentation personality comes in. All the good and all the bad, all the evil and the hate can't reside in one place. And it's not going to hear about a motive. You're not going to be given a motive about why Ms. Stauch, January 2020. Reason is there is no motive. Killer Gannon's head. Stauch's head. All the stab wounds, the shootings, the bruisings, the beatings, the burns. What was going through that person's head? I don't know. I don't know. I couldn't tell you. For the person that she was killing that day, attacking, it wasn't Gannon. It wasn't Gannon to her. Wake up that day and go, I'm going to kill him. No. She was killing the demons. Her life from the dark depths of her childhood and her life.